The moment my son's car disappeared down the driveway, our longtime pharmacy delivery man grabbed my arm and glanced nervously toward the house. "Your son isn't home, is he?" he whispered. "He just left," I replied. Without another word, he led me through the cold morning air to his delivery van and spread 2 prescription slips across the hood. "Please look carefully," he said, his jaw tight, his voice barely above a whisper. The second I saw the difference between them, my hands went numb. "Thank you for being here. It truly means the world. I'd love to know where you're joining us from today. Leave a comment with your city or country, and let's see how far this story travels." This story contains fictional elements created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual people or places is coincidental, but every lesson woven through it is absolutely worth carrying forward. I have replayed that Monday morning so many times that I could describe every detail with my eyes closed. The smell of coffee going cold on the counter, the pale October light through the kitchen curtains, the sound of Thomas's car backing out of the driveway at 8:47. An old judge's habit, I checked the clock. Time matters. Time always matters. I had just settled into my chair when the doorbell rang. Frank Guthrie stood on the porch, his gray delivery bag on one shoulder, a second smaller bag held carefully in his other hand. He had delivered my medications every Monday for 11 years, ever since my knees made the trip to Elm Street Pharmacy more trouble than it was worth. In 11 years, Frank had never once looked at me the way he was looking at me right now. His face was tight, not nervous, more like a man who had rehearsed something difficult and still wasn't sure he had the words right. "Good morning, Frank," I said. "Come on in, coffee's still warm." He stepped inside but didn't move toward the kitchen. He set the delivery bag down and looked past me toward the stairs. "Is your son home this morning, Mr. Calloway?" Something shifted in my chest. Not pain, not yet. Just a small wrongness. "Thomas left about 20 minutes ago," I said. "Why?" Frank exhaled slowly. He reached into the smaller bag and pulled out 2 pieces of paper, holding them carefully by the edges. "Please come with me," he said. "There's something you need to see." He led me to the delivery van. The October air was sharp and clean, the maple trees along Harwick Ridge Road burning red and gold. Frank spread both papers flat on the hood and stepped back. 2 prescription forms, side by side, both bearing Dr. Harrison's signature. I recognized Gerald's cramped cursive immediately. But the numbers were different. Frank's delivery records showed 40 micrograms of digoxin twice daily. The form actually filled and delivered to my house showed 80 micrograms twice daily. My hands gripped the hood of the van. Someone altered this after Dr. Harrison signed it. Frank set his jaw tight. "I've done this job 24 years. He does not prescribe 80 micrograms to a patient with your cardiac history. The maximum safe dose for someone your age with atrial fibrillation is 40 micrograms. Double that, taken consistently, your heart would simply stop. On any death certificate, it would read as natural cardiac failure. No one would question it." My throat tightened so sharply I had to look away. I stared at the red maple across the street and breathed slowly until the feeling passed enough to think. "How long?" I asked. 3 refills, Frank said. "Approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I had been swallowing a lethal dose every morning, washing it down with the coffee Brenda made, thanking her for her thoughtfulness. Frank's eyes were red at the corners when I looked back. "My wife passed 6 years ago," he said quietly. "Someone misled her about her treatment. I found out too late." His jaw tightened. "I am not going to be the person who stays quiet. Not again." My chest ached with the particular pain of recognizing one grieving man in another. After Frank drove away, I stood in my kitchen and counted the remaining pills one by one, laying them on the counter like evidence in a case I had not yet agreed to try. 14 tablets short. I set the bottle down. I looked up at the staircase 12 steps to the bedroom where Thomas and Brenda slept. The house was perfectly quiet. The coffee maker beeped once, announcing the pot had gone cold. She had made sure Thomas was gone before Frank arrived. I walked to the window. I looked at my maple trees burning red in the October morning. Then I went to the drawer beside the stove, found a pen, and started writing. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time, after Frank drove away, running cold water over my hands, even though they were not dirty. Maggie used to catch me doing this, standing at the sink, staring at nothing, and she would rest her chin on my shoulder and say, Arthur Calloway. Whatever that courtroom put in your head today, you can leave it at the door. She was the only person who ever talked to me that way. Like the robe and the gavel were something I could actually set aside. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, put the pill bottle back in the cabinet exactly where it had always been, because 30 years on the bench had burned one truth into me. Deeper than almost anything else, you do not let the other side know what you know. Not until you are ready. Thomas came home at 4:30. I was already in the armchair by the fireplace, the Pennsylvania Bar Journal open across my knees. I had not read a single word, but I looked like a man who had spent his afternoon exactly as he always did, and that was what mattered. "Hey, Dad, Frank come by this morning?" "Right on schedule," I said. "Knees are giving me grief. Nothing new." Thomas smiled a quick, genuine smile that reached his eyes before it faded too fast, like a light switched on in an empty room, then immediately off. He loved me. I was certain of that. The question turning itself over in my chest was whether he knew what his wife was doing. I did not yet know the answer. I was not sure I wanted to. Brenda came downstairs at 5, in a pale blue cardigan, moving through my kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had organized it exactly the way she wanted. She had rearranged my cabinets 4 months after moving in, just to make things more logical, Arthur. And I had said of course not, because she had asked so pleasantly and I had not yet learned to read the difference between pleasant and practiced. I watched her through the doorway. She moved between the stove and the counter, and then there it was, the thing I had seen 100 times without truly seeing it. Her hand rested briefly on the cabinet above the refrigerator, the medication cabinet. Not opening it, just touching it. The way you touch something so familiar the muscle remembers before the mind instructs. The hair on my arms rose beneath my sweater. She carried the tea out, set it down with a warm smile, and said, "Dr. Harrison's office called this afternoon. A reminder about your evening dose." My heart knocked hard against my ribs. Gerald Harrison had not called my house in 9 years. We communicated through the pharmacy. Through Frank. "I'll take it right after dinner," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady it was. After dinner, I went upstairs and stopped in the doorway of Maggie's reading room. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, dark walnut brass clasp from a Vermont antique market, a small dent in the upper left corner from the time Thomas dropped it at age 9 and burst into tears. I had not opened it since the night she died. Some things hold more than what's inside them, she used to say. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, pressing my palms flat against my thighs to stop the trembling I had been holding back since the moment Brenda's hand rested on that cabinet door. Then, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, I answered. Nothing, just breathing slow, deliberate. Then a click, silence. I wrote the number down on a grocery receipt in careful block letters, folded it, and put it in my breast pocket close to my heart. Outside, the October wind pulled the last red leaves loose in the dark. I did not sleep much that night. I lay on my side of the bed, still my side after 3 years alone, still the left side closest to the window, still leaving the right side, undisturbed the way you leave a place, set at a table for someone who is no longer coming, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house breathe around me, the pipes in the walls, the occasional creak of the floor above the kitchen where something always settled in the cold, the distant sound of wind in the maples. At some point before dawn, I reached over to Maggie's nightstand and picked up the small framed photograph she had kept there, the two of us at Thomas's college graduation. Maggie laughing at something just outside the frame, her hand pressed flat against my chest, the way she always stood when she was happy. I held it in the dark for a long time, without looking at it, just feeling the weight of the frame in my hands, and then I set it back exactly where it belonged and got up. Rex was waiting for me at the bedroom door. He did that every morning, positioned himself precisely in the center of the doorway, sometime before I woke, so that the first thing my feet encountered when I swung them off the bed was the warm, solid weight of an 11-year-old German shepherd who had apparently decided years ago that mornings were his responsibility. I reached down and scratched behind his ears the way he liked, and he pressed his broad head up into my palm with a low, contented sound deep in his chest. "Good morning, old boy," I said. He wagged once a slow, dignified wag, the kind that said, I know, let's not make a production of it," and padded after me down the hall toward the kitchen. Maggie had given him to me on my 63rd birthday. She had driven 3 hours to a breeder in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and come home with a 10-week-old puppy wrapped in a blue fleece blanket deposited him in my lap without any preamble, and said, "His name is Rex because you're a retired judge, and I thought it was funny, and also because you're going to need someone to talk to when I'm not around." I had laughed and told her she was being morbid. She had been right, of course. She was almost always right about the things that mattered. I put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window, watching the backyard come gray and slow out of the dark, the old oak at the property line, the garden beds Maggie had planted along the south fence, the gap in the hedgerow, where Rex liked to investigate whatever the raccoons had disturbed in the night. The sky was the particular pale nothing of early October before the sun commits to rising. Then I went to the cabinet above the refrigerator. I took the pill bottle down and held it in both hands for a moment, turning it over, reading the label the way I had read it 100 times without truly reading it. Arthur J. Calloway. Digoxin 80 micrograms. Take 1 tablet twice daily with food. Dr. Harrison's name. The Elm Street Pharmacy address. Frank's careful dispensing label in the bottom right corner. I carried the bottle to the back door and called Rex in from the yard. He came immediately trotting across the frost-stiffened grass with his ears forward, his dark eyes bright and alert. I crouched down carefully, my knees complaining at the angle, and held the open bottle beneath his nose. What happened next, I was not entirely prepared for. Rex jerked his head back so sharply that he nearly knocked me off balance. His ears flattened, his lips pulled back just slightly, not a snarl, not quite, but the precursor to one, the expression that meant something was deeply fundamentally wrong. And then he turned and pointed his muzzle directly at the staircase visible through the back door, and the length of the kitchen, the staircase that led up to the second floor, and he began to bark. Not the bark he used for squirrels, not the bark he used for delivery trucks, or unfamiliar cars on the road. This was the bark I had heard exactly twice in 11 years, once when a stranger had pushed open the back gate uninvited, and once when a gas leak from the old furnace had begun filling the basement before either Maggie or I had noticed anything. The bark that said danger, here, now, easy. I set my hand on his neck, feeling the tension vibrating through him like a struck wire. Easy, Rex. Good boy. He stopped barking, but he did not look away from the stairs. His body stayed rigid under my hand, every muscle held. I straightened up my knees, aching, and looked at the staircase myself. Empty. Quiet. Just the ordinary morning light beginning to press through the hallway window above the landing. But Rex had not barked toward Thomas's side of the hallway. He had not barked at the walls, or the ceiling, or the general direction of upstairs. He had pointed with the precision of an animal that does not second-guess its own senses directly toward the room at the end of the second-floor hall, Brenda's side of the master bedroom. I went to the downstairs bathroom. I emptied every remaining tablet from the bottle into the toilet and flushed it without ceremony and without hesitation, watching the small white pills spiral down and disappear. Then I went to the kitchen cupboard, where Maggie had always kept a backup supply of various vitamins. She had been religious about supplements, convinced that vitamin C prevented everything from the common cold to existential despair. And I found a nearly full bottle of 500 milligram vitamin C tablets. The tablets were roughly the same size and color as my digoxin prescription. Close enough. I transferred a week's worth into the empty prescription bottle, put the bottle back in the cabinet above the refrigerator, in exactly the position it had always occupied, and closed the cabinet door. 20 minutes later, Brenda came downstairs. She was dressed already. She was always dressed by 7:30. Another thing I had noticed without filing away, and she moved into the kitchen with the efficiency that I had once read as simply being organized and now read as something else entirely. She filled the electric kettle, she took down her tea things, and then on her way back to the counter, her hand dropped briefly to the cabinet handle above the refrigerator, the same motion I had watched the evening before. Checking. She was checking. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, turning to face me with a smile that showed her teeth. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," I said, which was almost true. "I was going to remind you about your morning dose," she said, nodding toward the cabinet. I pushed back from the table, opened the cabinet, shook one vitamin C tablet into my palm, with the practiced ease of a man who had done this every morning for months. I placed it on my tongue. I swallowed it with a sip of coffee. I set the cup back down and looked at her directly. "Thank you, Brenda," I said. "I don't know what I'd do without you keeping track of things." Something moved behind her eyes, quick, subtle, the briefest flicker of satisfaction. She smiled again and turned back to her tea, and I looked down at Rex sitting at my feet. He was watching Brenda's back, with his ears slightly forward and his body perfectly still. I reached down and rested my hand on his head. Then I went to my study, sat down at my desk, took out the plain black notebook I had bought at the drugstore on Elm Street 6 years ago, and never used, and opened it to the first page. At the top, I wrote the date. Tuesday, October 8th, 2024. Below it, I wrote 2 words. Day 1. I uncapped my pen. Outside the study window, the October sun was finally clearing the tree line, burning the frost off the grass in slow rolling patches of gold. Somewhere upstairs, I could hear Brenda's footsteps moving back and forth across the bedroom floor, steady, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who believed everything was still going exactly according to plan. I began to write. By the end of the second week, the notebook had 31 entries. I had developed a system, the kind of system that 30 years on the bench teaches you without your realizing it, the same way you learn to read a witness's hands before their mouth has finished forming the first syllable of a lie. Every observation went in. Time, context, physical detail. Nothing interpreted yet, just facts laid flat on the page the way you lay evidence on a table before you begin to build an argument from it. The facts at the end of 2 weeks were these. Brenda left the house every Tuesday and every Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Not approximately 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock. I checked my watch against the kitchen clock 3 Tuesdays in a row, and the variation was never more than 4 minutes in either direction. That kind of consistency does not happen by accident. That is a schedule. That is a commitment someone has made to be somewhere specific reliably, without fail. The kind of commitment that does not get rescheduled for rain or a headache or a difficult morning. Thomas told me Tuesday was yoga and Thursday was book club. I did not say anything when he told me that. I just nodded and wrote it down. The problems with yoga were several. Brenda came home without the particular looseness in her shoulders that I had observed over the years in women who actually practiced it, that specific quality of relaxed musculature that yoga produces in the upper back and neck and is almost impossible to fake. Her hair was never damp at the nape when she returned the way it would be after 60 minutes of movement in a heated studio. And she never mentioned a class and instructor, a pose she was working toward, any of the conversational texture that accumulates naturally around something a person actually does twice a week for weeks on end. The problems with book club were simpler. In 6 weeks, she had not once carried a book out of or into this house. Not a paperback, not a library copy, not even a phone with a reading application open on the screen. People who attend book club carry books the way people who go fishing carry fishing rods. It is not something they forget. What Brenda did carry every Thursday without exception was the faint smell of a coffee shop, dark roast, something richer and more specific than what we kept in the kitchen. The smell clung to her cardigan when she hung it by the door. I noticed it the second Thursday and wrote it down. The third Thursday, I was certain enough to underline it. I checked her car's odometer on a Tuesday morning before she left, crouching beside the driver's side door, with my hand braced against the roof and my knees conducting their usual correspondence of complaint up through my hips. 34 miles on the return. Exactly enough distance to reach the Route 12 commercial district and come back. I had sketched a map of Harwick Township from memory on the back of a page in the notebook, and I drew a circle with a radius of 17 miles centered on our address and stared at what fell inside it. The Route 12 corridor, 3 shopping plazas, a dozen office buildings, a street called Miller, which meant nothing to me, yet but which I wrote down anyway because a judge learns early that the details that mean nothing yet are precisely the ones worth keeping. Then Thomas knocked on the study door. "Hey, Dad." He pushed it open and leaned against the frame hands in his pockets, and I saw the thing behind his eyes again, that low, persistent worry he had been carrying for weeks, like a stone in his shoe present in every step but never once mentioned. He had been building up to something. I could see it in the way he was standing, the rehearsed casualness of a man who has decided what he is going to say and is now committed to delivering it. "Brenda thinks it might be a good idea to update your life insurance paperwork, just to make sure everything's current. She said she could help with the forms if you want." My pen stopped moving. I kept my face entirely neutral, a skill refined across 3 decades of hearing things in courtrooms that should have produced a visible reaction and did not. I was very good at this. It was perhaps the most useful thing the law had given me. That's thoughtful of her, I said. I'll look into it. Thomas nodded, visibly relieved that I hadn't questioned it, and that relief told me something I had not wanted, confirmed that he had been anxious about asking, that someone had coached him on how to raise the subject, that this conversation had been planned and rehearsed before it arrived at my door. The relief of a man who feared pushback and did not receive it. I recognized it from years of watching witnesses leave the stand. After he left, I sat for a long time with my pen resting against the open page. Then I picked up the telephone, the landline not my cell, and dialed a number I had not dialed in nearly 2 years. Carol Simmons picked up on the second ring. "Arthur," she said, just my name. In that single word, I could hear her recalibrate the way a sharp mind shifts without announcement, from whatever it was doing to full and complete attention. "This is unexpected. I have a question," I said. "A hypothetical." "Of course it is," she said, with the precise dryness she had deployed in oral argument for 30 years. "Go ahead." If a private citizen in Pennsylvania were to document the behavior of someone in their household, observations times, patterns, what are the legal boundaries on how that documentation could be used? A pause. Carol did not need long pauses. That depends entirely on how it's collected. Observation is generally fine. You're in your own home, you have standing. Recording is more complicated. Pennsylvania is an all-party consent state. Every person in a recorded conversation must consent to being recorded. If someone records without that consent, the recording is inadmissible and the person recording could face criminal exposure. Another pause shorter. "Arthur, are you in some kind of trouble?" I looked at the notebook open on the desk. 31 entries, pattern established. Brenda's name written at the top of a fresh page with a question mark beside it that I had been staring at for 2 weeks. "Not yet," I said. "I'm just being careful." "Be very careful," Carol said quietly, "and call me again when the hypothetical becomes real." I set the phone down. Outside the study window, the late afternoon light was going amber across the yard, and Rex was lying on the back porch with his chin on his paws, watching the garden the way he always watched things. He had decided required monitoring with the patient, unhurried attention of an animal who understood that waiting and doing nothing were not the same thing at all. I turned back to the notebook. Below Brenda's name and the question mark, I wrote 4 more words. "She is moving faster." I found Ray Kowalski's number in the back of an old address book I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. The kind of address book nobody uses anymore. Brown leather, the spine cracked from years of being opened and closed in a hurry. His entry was written in Maggie's handwriting, not mine. She had added him to the book herself, after the retirement party we'd thrown for him, when he left the force insisting that people worth knowing deserved to be written down somewhere that couldn't be accidentally deleted. I stared at her handwriting for longer than I intended to. Then I picked up my cell phone and dialed. Ray answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular roughness of a man who had spent too many years in Pittsburgh winters and not enough years sleeping. "Judge Calloway," he said, and I could hear the surprise in it, genuine, unguarded. "Well, it's been a while." "It has," I said. "I need to see you, Ray, in person, not here." A beat of silence. Then, "How soon?" "Tomorrow if you can manage it." "Veterans Memorial Park," he said immediately. "The bench by the fountain on the east side, 11 o'clock. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what it was about. 28 years after I had supervised his first week as a courthouse intern, Ray Kowalski still operated on the same principle he always had when Judge Calloway says, "It's important you show up and you listen first." I had always respected that about him. The drive to Pittsburgh the next morning took just under 2 hours. I told Thomas I had a doctor's appointment in the city, which was the first deliberate lie I had told my son in his entire 44 years of life. The words came out of my mouth smoothly, and that smoothness frightened me more than the lie itself. How easily deception learned, how quickly the tongue adapted to protecting what the heart could not yet afford to lose. Ray was already on the bench when I arrived, a paper coffee cup in each hand, his collar turned up against the October wind off the river. He had put on some weight since I'd last seen him, and his hair had gone almost entirely gray at the temples, but he stood up when he saw me coming across the grass, and his face broke into the same crooked grin he'd had at 27. "Judge." He handed me one of the coffees and looked me over with the careful eyes of a man trained to notice things. Whatever he saw made the grin fade slightly. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Closer to 2, I said. We sat. I told him everything, all of it, in the ordered, precise way I had once presented cases, moving from established fact to established fact, without editorializing, without emotion, the way you build a structure that cannot be argued with. Frank's discovery, the altered prescription, the pattern in the notebook, Thomas and the insurance policy, the phone call with nothing on the other end but breathing. Ray listened without interrupting, his coffee cup held in both hands, his eyes on the fountain in front of us. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of a man with nothing to say, but the quiet of a man arranging what he has just heard into the right shape. She's been doing this for a while, he said finally. It wasn't a question. That's what I need you to find out, I said. Ray turned to look at me directly then, and his expression did something complicated, the particular look of a man who cares about someone and is about to say something that person may not want to hear. Judge, you sure you want to open this door? Because once I start pulling threads on something like this, I can't put them back. Whatever's on the other side of the door, you're going to have to live with knowing it. I thought about Maggie's handwriting in the address book. I thought about Thomas's face when he asked about the insurance policy, the relief when I didn't push back, the coach smoothness of a man who had been told what to say and how to say it. That's exactly why I called you, I said. I need someone I trust completely on the outside of that house. You're the only one, Ray. Something moved across his face, not quite emotion, but the acknowledgement of it, the way a man who has trained himself out of sentiment still lets it surface for a second before putting it back where it belongs. He nodded once firmly and extended his hand. I shook it. 2 things, I said before he could stand. First, Nicholas Farrell. He's a pharmacist at Elm Street Pharmacy in Harwick. I want to know everything about him. Finances, associations, anything that doesn't add up. I paused. Second, and this is important, Ray. If you ever get into a situation where you're in the same room as Brenda or Nicholas, stay in the room. Don't observe from outside. Don't listen through a wall. Be a participant in whatever conversation happens. You understand why? Ray understood immediately. Pennsylvania's wiretapping law required the consent of all parties to a recorded conversation. But federal law allowed recording when at least one participant in the conversation consented. If Ray was in the room, he was a participant. If Ray was outside listening, he was a criminal. I understand completely, he said. I'll be careful. He took the photograph of Brenda I had brought, printed from a family picture Thomas had posted online 2 summers ago. Brenda smiling at a 4th of July cookout, holding a glass of iced tea and looking exactly like someone's perfectly ordinary daughter-in-law. Ray looked at it for a moment. Pretty woman, he said. That's what makes her dangerous, I said. I drove home through the gray October afternoon with the heater running and both hands on the wheel, and the particular feeling in my chest of a man who has just set something in motion that cannot be stopped. It was not entirely unpleasant. It was, in fact, the closest thing to solid ground I had felt since Monday morning. My phone rang at 7:43 that evening. Ray. Judge. His voice had lost the easy tone from the park bench. It was clipped, now focused. The woman your daughter-in-law meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's not a yoga instructor and it's not a book club. It's a man named Nicholas Farrell. They meet at an apartment on Miller Street, same time every week, always exactly 90 minutes. A pause. Judge, I pulled 6 weeks of footage from a parking camera across the street. This has been going on for at least a year, probably longer. My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles ached. Keep going, I said. Find everything. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier, while Thomas and Brenda were both at the breakfast table. I heard the knock at the front door and got there before either of them could offer to answer it. I'm expecting something from my accountant, I said, which was not entirely a lie because what Ray had sent me was, in its own way, an accounting of the most precise and unwelcome kind. I signed for the package with my back to the kitchen doorway, slid it inside my cardigan against my ribs, and returned to my half-eaten oatmeal like a man with nothing on his mind but the weather. Brenda watched me sit back down. I felt her eyes on me, the way you feel a draft from a window you can't quite locate, present, persistent, coming from a direction you haven't identified yet. She was very good at that kind of watching. I had mistaken it for attentiveness for 4 years. Anything important? She asked pleasantly. Tax documents, I said. Terribly dull. She smiled and reached for her coffee, and I ate the rest of my oatmeal and talked with Thomas about whether the roof needed work before the first snow. and I did not look at the envelope pressed against my ribs once. Not once. 30 years on the bench teaches you things about keeping your face still that no acting class ever could. I read it that night alone after the house had gone quiet and Thomas had gone to bed and Brenda's light under her door had finally gone dark. Crestline Property Group was registered in Delaware, a common choice for shell companies, because Delaware's incorporation laws required almost no disclosure of ownership, which was precisely the point. On paper, it was a real estate investment firm, with offices listed at an address in Center City, Philadelphia, that turned out when Ray checked to be a mailbox rental storefront on the ground floor of a building that housed, among other things, a dry cleaner and a nail salon. No physical office, no staff, no verifiable assets. No evidence that Crestline Property Group had ever purchased, developed, or sold a single piece of real estate in its existence. Thomas had signed a personal guarantee for a $2.1 million loan taken out in Crestline's name from a private lending group based in Northeast Philadelphia. The kind of lender that did not advertise in the yellow pages, did not report to credit bureaus, and collected its debts through methods that fell somewhere in the gray territory between aggressive and criminal. Under Pennsylvania law, a personal guarantee meant exactly what it sounded like. Thomas had put his name on a line that said, "If this company cannot pay, I will." He owned no assets anywhere near that figure. What he did have as Brenda's husband was a legal claim to whatever came to him through his father's estate. I set the pages down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood and made myself breathe slowly, deliberately, from the bottom of the lungs, the way I had learned to breathe in courtrooms, when a piece of testimony landed harder than expected. The mahogany desktop was cool beneath my hands. Outside the study window, the October night was completely still, the kind of still that comes after the temperature drops past a certain point, and even the wind decides it has somewhere better to be. Thomas had not done this knowingly. I was as certain of that as I had ever been certain of anything in 30 years of reading human beings across a courtroom floor. My son was not a sophisticated man. When it came to financial instruments, he was a decent man who trusted the people he loved, which had always been both his finest quality and his greatest vulnerability. Brenda had handed him a pen, pointed to a line, told him it was a safe investment opportunity, with strong upside, and Thomas had signed because Thomas believed her, because Thomas had loved her, because Thomas had not yet learned what I was learning now at 74 years old, which was that some people wear warmth the way other people wear a coat, something to put on when the weather requires it and take off the moment they get inside. My eyes burned. I told myself I was not going to cry, and then I was briefly and furiously my hand pressed hard over my mouth, so the sound would not carry through the ceiling above me, one hard, silent wave of grief for my son, for his good-natured foolishness, for the 4 years he had spent loving someone who had looked at him from the very beginning and seen nothing but a means to an end, not a husband, not a man, a signature on a line, a door into his father's estate. I got myself back. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I sat for a long moment with the pages in front of me and the dark house around me and Rex breathing steadily against my ankle under the desk, his chin on my foot, the way it always was, when he understood on whatever level dogs understand such things, that I needed the weight of him there. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Light. Deliberate. Stopping at the landing. Then continuing slower toward the study door. I killed the desk lamp in one motion, the room dropping into darkness so complete that for a moment all I could see was the thin line of hallway light beneath the study door. I pressed the documents flat into the hidden shelf behind the row of Pennsylvania statutes and sat back in my chair and arranged my hands in my lap and waited. The door handle moved, just slightly, just enough to test whether the latch had caught. Then Brenda's voice soft and solicitous through the wood. "Arthur, I saw the light under the door. Are you feeling all right?" I counted 3 full seconds in my head, exactly the length of time a man who had dozed off in his armchair would need to surface. Not 2 seconds, not 4, 3. "Just resting my eyes," I said. My voice came out perfectly level. I was almost surprised. "I'm fine, Brenda. Thank you for checking." A pause on the other side of the door. I could not hear her breathing. I could not hear anything at all. Then her footsteps retreated back down the hallway, unhurried, patient. The footsteps of someone who had decided that whatever she had come to find out could wait until morning. Rex exhaled slowly against my ankle. I reached down in the dark and found his ear. I know, I whispered. Me too. I sat there for a long time, without moving in the dark, with my hand on my old dog's head, and the hidden shelf of documents behind me, and the house breathing quietly around us. And I thought about Thomas sleeping upstairs with no idea that the woman beside him had used his name as a key to a door she intended to open, once I was no longer in a position to lock it. Then I opened the notebook. I found the page where I had written, Brenda. Who are you really? And below it, I wrote something new. She came to the door tonight. I underlined it once, then I capped my pen, put the notebook away, and went to bed. I had spent 30 years watching people lie to my face. Not casual lies, the careful, prepared kind, the kind that come with eye contact and steady breathing, and just enough truth mixed in to make the whole thing hold together. I had watched defendants lie and witnesses lie, and occasionally, to my deep private sorrow, I had watched lawyers lie, and what I had learned across all those years was this. The lie itself is rarely where you find the truth. The truth lives in the moment, just before the lie in the half second, when the face does something the mind hasn't yet authorized. I went to Elm Street Pharmacy on a Wednesday morning when Frank was not on shift. I had called ahead not to the pharmacy, but to Frank directly on the cell number he had given me the morning of the delivery. I told him I needed to know Nicholas Farrell's schedule without Nicholas knowing I had asked. Frank told me without hesitation, and the steadiness in his voice when he did it told me he had been waiting for exactly this kind of request. The pharmacy was quiet when I pushed through the door, the bell above the frame giving its small announcement. A young woman at the far end of the counter was stocking shelves with her back to me. Behind the pharmacy partition, Nicholas Farrell was entering something into a computer, and he looked up when I came in with the automatic pleasantness of a man in a customer-facing role. And then he saw my face and something happened behind his eyes. Not recognition. Something more careful than that. The expression of a man who has been told to watch for something and is now deciding whether this is it. It lasted less than a second. Then the smile came up professional and warm, and he stepped toward the counter. Good morning, sir. Can I help you? I had decided on my approach during the drive over. Not confrontation. I had no leverage for confrontation yet. What I wanted was data. I wanted to see how he moved, how he talked, where his eyes went when he was uncomfortable. I wanted the half second before the lie. I hope so, I said, letting my voice go slightly vague, slightly slower than normal, the cadence of a man whose mind was not quite as sharp as it used to be. My doctor mentioned something about a possible interaction between my heart medication and the blood pressure pills I've been taking. I was hoping someone could walk me through it. Nicholas leaned on the counter with both forearms, his posture open and attentive. He was good-looking in a tired way, the kind of face that had probably been very charming 10 years ago, and was now carrying something heavy that hadn't been there before. Dark circles. A tension around the jaw that didn't go away when he smiled. He walked me through the interaction patiently, clearly using plain language without being condescending. Under other circumstances, I might have found him likable. I let my eyes move past him while he talked. Through the partition window visible at the angle I was standing, the parking lot held exactly 3 vehicles: a Honda, a Ford pickup, and a Mercedes-Benz GLE current model year, parked at an angle that suggested someone accustomed to having plenty of space. The parking habit of a man who was very attached to the condition of his car, I calculated quickly. A pharmacist in an independent practice in this part of Pennsylvania would earn somewhere between $85,000 and $100,000 annually. The Mercedes started at $72,000. New. I accidentally let my cane tip sideways against the counter. Nicholas caught it before it fell, leaning across with both hands, and as he straightened, I saw his left wrist, clearly a Rolex Submariner, the kind that retailed for $12,000 and above. Thank you, I said. These old hands. He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes, and I felt something almost like pity for him, the specific pity you feel for someone who is in far deeper than they understood when they got in. Is there anything else I can help you with? He asked. I paused. Let my expression go thoughtful, mildly confused the way a man searches for a word that has slipped away from him. There was one more thing. My neighbor, older gentleman, similar heart condition to mine, his doctor recently adjusted his digoxin dosage, and he's been asking me about it. Is that a medication you carry regularly? The smile stayed on Nicholas Farrell's face. Every muscle that controlled it held its position with admirable discipline, but his right hand resting on the counter beside the register, pressed flat against the surface, the fingers going white at the tips, for just a moment before relaxing. There it was, the half-second before the lie. "We carry it, yes," he said. His voice was perfectly even. "It's a fairly common cardiac medication. Is your neighbor having any concerns about his dosage?" "Oh, probably nothing," I said, waving a hand. "You know how it is at our age. We worry about everything." I thanked him for his time and made my way back out through the door, moving at the careful pace of a man whose knees were troubling him, and stood on the sidewalk in the November wind and wrote his license plate number in my notebook with fingers that were not quite steady. My phone rang before I had finished writing the last digit. R.A. His voice had a new quality I hadn't heard from him before, compressed like a man speaking carefully in a space where he wasn't sure who else could hear. "Judge, I need to tell you something about Nicholas Farrell." A pause. "He was arrested in Allegheny County in 2019. Prescription fraud. The case was dropped after 3 weeks." Another pause waited. "Someone paid his legal retainer in cash. Judge." I traced the payment account. It was opened 6 months before Brenda married Thomas. The wind off the street pushed cold against my face. "She recruited him before the marriage," I said. "Before the marriage," Ray confirmed. "This wasn't improvised, Judge. This was planned." I stood on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy, where Nicholas Farrell was probably still standing behind his counter, smiling at the next customer, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light. And I thought about Harold Weston in New Jersey, who I did not yet know about. And I thought about Maggie. And I thought about Thomas signing his name to a document he didn't understand, because his wife had handed him a pen. "Keep pulling," I said. "Don't stop." I waited until Thursday evening, one of the nights Brenda came home smelling of dark roast coffee, and Thomas stayed late at a showing across town, and I locked the study door and sat down at my desk and dialed Carol Simmons on the landline. She picked up on the second ring. "Arthur." Just my name, the way she always said it, like a period at the end of a sentence, like something being confirmed. "I've been expecting you to call again. I need more than a hypothetical this time, Carol." A brief pause. I heard her set something down, a glass, maybe the soft clink of it against a hard surface. "Then tell me everything, from the beginning. Leave nothing out." So I did. I talked for almost 20 minutes without stopping, which was something I had not done since Maggie's funeral, when I had stood at the podium in St. Michael's and spoken about a woman I had loved for 38 years in front of 300 people, without once looking down at the notes I had prepared. Carol listened the way she always had in the courtroom, completely without interruption, without the small affirmative sounds that lesser listeners use to signal attention. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing slow and steady, the breathing of a woman organizing what she had just heard into something she could work with. "All right," she said finally. "4 things. Write them down." I already had my pen in my hand. First, Carol said, "Your observations. The notebook, the odometer, the pattern, all of that is admissible in Pennsylvania as private citizen documentation. You're not law enforcement. You're not bound by the same collection rules. Keep writing everything down and date every entry." "Done," I said. Second, her voice sharpened slightly the way it did in oral argument. When she was about to say something she needed the other person to actually hear. "Audio recording is where you have to be careful, Arthur. Pennsylvania is an all-party consent state under Title 18, Section 5, 1703. Every person in a recorded conversation must consent to being recorded. If Ray records Brenda or Nicholas without their knowledge from outside the room, that recording is inadmissible and Ray could face criminal charges." "He's already aware," I said. "I told him to stay in the room, to be a participant." "Good." A pause. "If Ray is genuinely present in the conversation, invited in speaking an actual participant, then federal law governs and federal law only requires one party's consent. The recording holds. But he cannot be in a hallway with his ear against a door, Arthur. He has to be inside." "Understood completely." Third, I heard her shift in her chair. The familiar creak of it. Carol had kept the same leather chair in her home office for 20 years, refused to replace it, claimed it had earned its place. "Your assets. You need a revocable living trust, and you need it this week, not next month. I'll draft it tonight. It puts your estate, the house, the investment accounts, everything into a trust with Thomas as the sole beneficiary. It bypasses probate entirely, which means if something happens to you, Brenda has no legal standing to contest the distribution as Thomas's spouse. The assets go directly to Thomas, and she cannot touch them. My chest loosened slightly, the particular relief of a man who has been holding something heavy and has just been shown where to set it down. I'll need to sign it before a notary, I said. I'll arrange for one to come to the house, Carol said. Someone I trust. We'll do it on a morning when Brenda is out. A pause. Arthur, I'm also going to reach out to someone at the FBI's Philadelphia field office, an agent named Diana Reeves. She runs elder financial exploitation cases, and she's good methodical patient, not the kind who moves before the case is airtight. I want her to know this exists before you need her, so that when you do need her, she's already read the file. What will she need? 3 things. The recording, if Ray gets it. The New Jersey connection, if Ray finds it, because if Brenda has done this before, that changes everything from a state matter to a federal pattern. And the prescription evidence, Frank's testimony, the 2 forms side by side. A pause. Arthur, is Frank willing to go on record? Without hesitation, I said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Carol said something she had never said to me in 30 years of friendship, and the unexpectedness of it made my throat tighten in a way I had not anticipated. Arthur, she said quietly, when Margaret was sick, you came to court every single day, and you did your job, and you never once let anyone see what it was costing you. I watched you do that for 14 months, and I thought it was the bravest thing I had ever seen. A beat. I need you to know that what you're doing right now, sitting in that house every day and keeping your face straight and protecting your son without him knowing it, I think that's braver. My jaw tightened. My eyes burned at the corners, sudden and unwelcome. How is Thomas? She asked. In all of this, I had to wait a moment before I could answer. He doesn't know yet, I said. That's the hardest part, Carol, having to look at him every morning across that breakfast table and smile and ask about his work and act like everything is exactly as it has always been. I pressed my free hand flat against the desk. He's going to be devastated when he finds out, not because of what Brenda did, because of what he didn't see. He'll survive it, Carol said firmly. He has you. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the study window, the November dark had come down early and completely the way it did in Pennsylvania. Once the clocks changed the yard, visible only as shapes and shadows beyond the glass. Rex was lying under the desk with his chin on my foot, a warm, steady pressure that I had come to rely on more than I would ever admit to anyone living. I'll have the trust drafted by morning, Carol said. And Arthur, one more thing. Yes, be careful what you say inside that house. Her voice was very level. If Brenda is who you think she is, she's done this before. People who have done this before are very good at knowing when something has changed. Don't give her anything to read. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, an old man at a desk, a phone pressed to his ear, a dog at his feet. I learned to keep my face still a long time ago, I said. I know you did, Carol said. Good night, Arthur. I set the phone down. I sat for a long time, without moving my hand, resting on the closed notebook, the house quiet around me, except for the wind in the eaves and Rex's slow, even breathing against my ankle. Then I opened the notebook, uncapped my pen, and wrote 4 words at the top of a fresh page. Building the truth. Carefully. Before I tell you what Ray found in New Jersey, something that changed everything, I thought I understood about the woman living in my house. Drop a 9 in the comments, so I know you're still here with me. Every single number means the world. Just a reminder, this story contains some fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. If that's not your preference, no hard feelings, you're welcome to step away at any time. But if you're staying what Ray uncovered next, we'll leave you speechless. The second envelope from Ray was thin. 4 pages, maybe 5. I knew from experience, 30 years of it, that the thinnest files were rarely the least important. The thinnest files were the ones where someone had worked very hard to make sure there was almost nothing to find. I read it at my desk on a Tuesday morning, while the house was empty, Rex stretched across my feet, the November rain coming down the study window in long gray streaks. I read it once quickly, the way you read something when part of you is hoping you misunderstood. Then I read it again slowly, the way you read something when you know you didn't. Harold Weston, 78 years old, widower, retired civil engineer, Essex County, New Jersey, died February 14th, 2018. Valentine's Day, which struck me as the kind of detail that a cruel universe arranges with particular deliberateness. Cause of death listed on the certificate hypertensive cardiovascular disease. No autopsy had been performed. There had been no reason to perform one. Harold Weston was a 78-year-old man with a documented heart condition, and he had died in his home, and the physician who signed the death certificate had seen nothing that warranted further investigation. His caregiver for the 8 months preceding his death had been a woman named Diane Marsh. I stared at that name for a long time. Attached to the file was a photocopy of a New Jersey caregiver registration document required by state law for anyone providing paid in-home care to a senior resident. The photograph on the registration was small and slightly blurred from the copying, but I had looked at the face in that photograph every single day across my breakfast table for the past 4 years. Yeah, younger, hair a different color, lighter through the jaw, but the eyes were the same, that particular quality of attention, watchful and controlled, that I had read as conscientiousness and now understood as something else entirely. Brenda was Diane Marsh. My hands were pressing so hard against the desk that my knuckles had gone white, and I made myself release the pressure deliberately, finger by finger, the way you talk yourself down from something in a courtroom when a piece of testimony lands harder than you expected. Ray's handwritten note was on the last page, clipped to the back. Judge, I spoke to Harold's nephew, a man named Gary Weston who lives in Montclair. He told me Harold changed in the months before he died, became confused, withdrawn. Gary assumed it was age. He said Diane Marsh was always there, always helpful, always making sure Harold took his medications on schedule. Gary never liked her, but couldn't say why. After Harold died, she was gone within 48 hours. So, was approximately $340,000 from a joint account Harold had given her power of attorney over 6 months earlier. Harold Weston was never tested for digoxin levels post-mortem. I checked with the NJ Medical Examiner's Office standard cardiovascular death in an elderly patient with existing heart disease does not trigger mandatory toxicology screening unless there's an active reason to suspect foul play. There wasn't. Nobody was looking. If Agent Reeves can get a federal warrant, Essex County will cooperate with an exhumation order. NJME office confirmed this to me off the record. The body has been in ground storage. Conditions are sufficient for post-mortem digoxin testing even after 6 years. Judge, Harold Weston had nobody in his corner. I think you should know that. I set the pages down. Outside the window, Thomas was coming up the front walk with his collar turned up against the rain, his shoulders hunched, moving with the distracted energy of a man whose mind was somewhere other than his body. He had told me at breakfast he had 2 showings today on the north side of Harwick. A young couple buying their first home, he'd said, and his face had done the thing it did when he talked about work. He actually liked opening slightly. The worry retreating for a moment. My son, who had signed his name to a document he didn't understand because he trusted the person who handed him the pen, who came home every evening and cooked pasta and asked about my knees and had no idea that the woman sleeping beside him had done this before to a man named Harold who had nobody in his corner. My chest hurt with a grief that was different from anything I had felt since Maggie, not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of understanding how much had already been lost before anyone thought to look. I heard Thomas's key in the front door. I pressed the pages flat, slid them into the hidden shelf behind the law books, and by the time Thomas pushed the study door open and said, "Hey Dad, miserable out there, you want lunch?" I was sitting with the Pennsylvania Bar Journal open across my knees, and Rex was lifting his head from my feet, and the room looked exactly as it always had. "Lunch sounds good," I said. "How are the showings?" He grinned the real grin, the one that still looked like the boy who had skinned his knee on the driveway at age 7 and cried for 30 seconds before deciding he was fine. "Young couple, first house. They loved it. I think they're going to make an offer." "Good," I said. "That's good, son." He went to the kitchen to make sandwiches, and I sat in the study listening to him move around in there, the familiar sounds of cabinet doors and the knife on the cutting board. And I made myself a promise, the kind of promise a man makes, not in words, but somewhere underneath words, in the place where the things you cannot say out loud still manage to become permanent. I will not let what happened to Harold Weston happen to my son. My phone buzzed on the desk. Ray's number. I answered immediately. His voice was low and urgent in a way I had not heard from him before, the voice of a man speaking from somewhere he was not certain was safe. "Judge, I think I've been made. I need to go dark. Don't call this number." A breath. I already planted the recorder, Judge. Before they found me, it's in place. Don't look for it, it'll come to you. A pause that lasted long enough for me to understand. It was a goodbye of some kind. Watch yourself. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone in both hands, the rain still coming down the window, Thomas still moving around in the kitchen, making sandwiches for the two of us. And somewhere out there, Ray Kowalski was driving away from something that had gotten close enough to spook a man who did not spook easily. It'll come to you. I looked at Rex. He was already watching me, his dark eyes steady, his ears slightly forward. All right, I said quietly. To Rex, to the room, to whatever came next. All right, before I reveal what was inside that recorder, the words I heard that made my hands go cold, I want you to type 10 in the comments right now. Let me know you're still here, because what comes next is the moment everything finally came into the light. A gentle note: portions of this story are fictional, shaped to carry a message worth hearing. If you prefer not to continue, you're free to step away, no judgment at all. But if you're staying, hold on tight. 3 days passed without a word from Ray. I checked my phone every morning when I woke and every night before I slept. The way you check a wound you are trying not to think about. Quickly, compulsively, already knowing it hasn't changed, but unable to stop yourself from looking. Nothing. His number rang through to a voicemail box that was full. His office line in Pittsburgh went to an answering service that told me Ray Kowalski Investigations was temporarily unavailable. I did not sleep well. I ate what Brenda put in front of me and said what needed to be said at the dinner table and went to bed at my usual time. And I lay in the dark and thought about Ray driving away from something, and I thought about Harold Weston, and I thought about the recorder that was supposed to come to me, and I thought about Thomas sleeping 12 steps above my head with no idea what was circling the house. On the third morning of Friday, I took Rex out to the backyard just after 6. The November air had a particular quality that morning, cold enough to sting the inside of the nose, the grass still stiff with frost, the sky the pale, colorless gray that comes just before the sun commits to rising. Rex moved ahead of me across the yard with his nose working low to the ground, following whatever narrative the night had left behind in the grass, and I walked behind him with my hands in the pockets of my coat and my cane tapping a slow rhythm on the frozen ground. He stopped at the azalea bushes along the back fence, not the tentative stop of a dog catching an interesting smell, the full committed stop of a dog that has found something. His tail stiffened, his nose went directly into the gap between the largest bush and the fence post, and he began to dig his front paws, working with a purposeful efficiency that I had seen before, exactly once when he had located Maggie's lost house keys beneath the rose bushes along the south garden wall. "Rex," I said, moving toward him, "what have you got?" He backed out of the bush and looked up at me, and in his mouth held carefully, gently, the way retrievers carry things they understand to be important, was a small black object wrapped in a clear Ziploc bag. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. I took it from his mouth and crouched there in the frost beside the azalea bushes, turning it over in my hands. A digital voice recorder, barely larger than a pack of chewing gum, sealed inside the bag with a small folded piece of paper. I unfolded the paper with fingers that were not entirely steady. Ray's handwriting, 4 words, Miller Street, October 18th. I straightened up and looked at Rex. He was watching me with his ears forward and his tail moving in a slow, careful arc. Not the excited wag of a dog that has done something fun, but the measured wag of a dog that understands it has done something that mattered. "Good boy," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. I went inside. I locked the study door. I sat down at my desk, plugged the earpiece into the recorder, and pressed play. Ray's voice came first, clear, deliberate, the voice of a man making a record. "This is Raymond Kowalski, licensed private investigator, Pennsylvania, license number PI22047. Recording made at 412. Miller Street Apartment, 3B, Harwick Township, Pennsylvania, October 18th, 2024, with my full knowledge and consent. I am a present participant in this conversation, having been invited into this residence by Nicholas Farrell on October 15th and asked to return today." A brief pause, then the sound of a door, footsteps, a chair scraping back. Nicholas's voice. "Ray, thanks for coming back. I wanted to..." And then a second door and heels on hardwood, and a voice I knew as well as I knew my own reflection. Brenda's voice. but not the voice she used in my house. Not the warm, attentive voice that asked if I had taken my morning pill and commented on the weather and laughed at Thomas's jokes. This voice was lower, flatter. The voice of a person who had stopped performing because they believed no one was watching. "Is he reliable?" she said, meaning Ray, meaning can we speak in front of him. "Yes," Nicholas said. "He's fine. I've known him 3 years. He's done work for me before off the books. He knows how to keep quiet." A pause. The sound of Brenda moving, settling into a chair. She had apparently decided. "How much longer does the old man have?" I pressed my hand over my mouth. "Nicholas?" "At the current dosage, assuming he's still taking it consistently, 3 weeks, maybe 4. It depends on his baseline cardiac function. He's stronger than he looks." "Brenda." 3 weeks is too long. Can we accelerate?" "Nicholas." "Not without raising flags. Digoxin toxicity that moves too fast looks different on a post-mortem than a gradual accumulation. If anyone looks closely, no one is going to look closely," Brenda said, and the certainty in her voice was the most frightening thing I had ever heard from a human being. "He's 74 with atrial fibrillation. He's going to have a cardiac event and his doctor is going to sign the certificate, and that is going to be the end of it." A silence. Then Nicholas quieter, and Thomas. "What about Thomas? After? What happens to—" "Thomas is a tool, Nick." Her voice was the same temperature as the frost outside my window. "A very useful, very stupid tool. Once we're done with the old man, Thomas gets blamed for the digoxin. I've already started building the paper trail search history on his laptop, a receipt from a vitamin supplier that happens to carry pharmaceutical-grade compounds. When the police look, they'll find exactly what I've put there for them to find. Thomas goes to prison, the insurance pays out to the estate, and we are not here when that happens." Nicholas. "Brenda, he has no idea. I know he doesn't." A pause, the sound of her heels on the hardwood moving. "That's what makes him useful." I stopped the recorder. I sat at my desk, and I did not move for a very long time. Rex had jumped up onto the chair beside me, the chair he was not supposed to be. On the chair Maggie had always pretended not to notice him occupying, and he pressed his broad head against my arm and made a low sound deep in his chest. Not quite a whimper, not quite a growl, something between the two. That meant he understood, on whatever level, dogs understand the things that break their people, that something had just broken. My hand found the top of his head. I thought about Thomas, my son who cooked pasta and talked about first-time homebuyers and had no idea that there was a receipt with his name on it. Somewhere in this house planted by the woman he slept beside, built a case that would send him to prison for a crime I had barely survived. My jaw tightened until it ached. I opened the notebook. I turned to the page where I had written, "Thomas is innocent," after reading the Crestline file, and I wrote it again larger this time, pressing hard enough that the pen indented the page beneath. "Thomas is innocent," underlined, twice. Then I heard the front door open, Brenda's voice calling up the stairs. To Thomas, cheerful and domestic and warm, asking what he wanted for dinner, and Thomas calling back down that anything was fine, whatever she felt like making. I looked at the recorder in my hand. Then I opened the cabinet behind my desk, placed the recorder inside behind the row of Pennsylvania statutes, and locked it. When Brenda appeared in the study doorway 10 minutes later, holding a fresh prescription in one hand and smiling, the smile I now understood completely. I looked up from the bar journal I had not been reading and said, "Brenda, is that my refill?" "Dr. Harrison called it in this morning," she said. I picked it up on my way back. I stood and crossed the room and took the bottle from her hand, and my hand did not shake and my face did not change. And I said, "Thank you, you're always so thoughtful." And I meant every word of it as the most precise and terrible lie I had ever told in my life. The knock came at 11:47. I know the exact time because I had been lying awake watching the red numbers on the bedside clock tick forward the way I had lain awake most nights that week. And when the sound came, I was already sitting up before I had consciously decided to move. 3 soft knocks, hesitant, the kind that hoped to be heard and feared it at the same time. I had heard that knock before. Thomas had knocked exactly that way on the door of my home office on the night before his college entrance exam, 17 years old and terrified and too proud to say so. He had knocked that way the night he called off his first engagement, standing in the hallway of the old house on Birchwood Drive, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was trying very hard not to need anyone. He had knocked that way the night Maggie's diagnosis came back, sitting outside the hospital room, because he couldn't make himself go back inside just yet. I knew what that knock meant. It meant my son had run out of places to put something and had come to the only door he trusted. "Come in," I said. He opened the door slowly. He was still dressed dark jeans, the gray flannel shirt he had had since graduate school, his feet bare on the hardwood floor. His eyes were red and raw at the edges in the way that comes not from a single bout of crying, but from hours of it, the deep exhausted redness of a man who had been fighting something all evening and losing. He was holding something in his right hand pressed against his thigh, as if he wasn't sure yet whether to show it to me. "Dad!" His voice cracked on the single syllable. He pressed his lips together, hard jaw working, and I watched my son, 44 years old, taller than me by 2 inches, a man who coached Little League in the spring and made his mother's pot roast recipe from memory fight himself, back from the edge of something with everything he had. "Sit down, son," I said. He crossed the room and dropped into the chair across from my desk, the way he had dropped into chairs since he was a teenager all at once, like a man whose legs have simply stopped cooperating. Rex, who had been asleep at the foot of my bed, lifted his head and then climbed down and went directly to Thomas, pressing his broad head against Thomas's knee, with the unerring instinct of an animal that understood where comfort was needed. Thomas put his hand on Rex's head, and his chin dropped to his chest, and his shoulders shook once hard before he brought himself back. "I need to show you something," he said. He put the object on the desk between us. It was a passport. American Navy blue, the gold eagle embossed on the cover. I opened it. The photograph inside was Brenda's face. The name printed beside it was Sandra Lee Morrison. The issue date was 8 months ago. My hands were perfectly steady. I had known something like this was coming, had known it in the way. You know, a storm is coming, when the barometric pressure drops and the birds go quiet. But knowing a thing and seeing it are different experiences. And for a moment, the passport sat in my hands like a physical weight that had no business being as heavy as it was. "I noticed," Thomas said, his voice low and scraped thin, "that she always entered the combination with her body turned away from me. 3 weeks ago I started paying attention, really paying attention." He swallowed. "I watched her do it 4 times. I memorized the sequence." He paused. "She went out Tuesday afternoon." I opened the safe. I looked up from the passport. "Thomas," I said carefully, "how long have you been worried about her?" He laughed a short, broken sound with no humor in it whatsoever, the laugh of a man who has asked himself a question and doesn't like the answer. "I don't know," he said. "Months, maybe. There were things I kept explaining away. The way she talked about your money sometimes, the questions she asked about the estate." He pressed his free hand over his eyes briefly, fingers splayed wide. "I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was a bad husband for even thinking it." His hand dropped. His eyes met mine, and they were devastated and clear, at the same time the eyes of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself. "I'm not being paranoid, am I, Dad?" It was not a question. I set the passport down on the desk between us. I looked at my son for a long moment. This man I had watched come into the world, watched take his first steps on the kitchen floor of the old house, watched stumble and recover and stumble again, in the particular way that decent people do, and I made a decision. "No," I said, "you're not being paranoid." And then I told him, "Not everything, not all at once, not the way you pull a bandage off quickly and hope the shock is brief." I told him about Frank first, about the prescription, about the 2 forms laid side by side on the hood of the delivery van. I watched the color leave his face. I told him about the notebook, the pattern ray. I watched his hands grip the arms of the chair. I told him about Crestline, about the $2.1 million, about his name on a guarantee for a company that existed only on paper. At that, Thomas made a sound low and involuntary, the sound of something structural giving way, and he bent forward with both elbows on his knees, and his face in his hands, and his shoulders heaved twice before he forced himself still. "She told me it was an investment," he said into his palms. His voice was muffled and wrecked and very young. "She said it was safe. She went over the documents with me. Dad, she sat right there at the kitchen table, and she explained every page, and He stopped. "I signed it. I just signed it." "I know," I said. "Thomas, look at me." He raised his face from his hands. His cheeks were wet, and he didn't bother with that, just looked at me straight on with the ruin-clear expression of a man who has just had the floor removed from beneath him. You signed it because you trusted your wife, I said. That is not a character flaw. That is not stupidity. That is what trust looks like, and what she did with it is on her, not on you. Do you hear me? His jaw tightened. He nodded once. There's one more thing, I said. I paused. This was the part I had rehearsed and unrehearsed a dozen times in the dark, and there was no version of it that didn't hurt. I have a recording, Thomas, from the apartment on Miller Street where she meets Nicholas Farrell. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. The name Nicholas Farrell landing somewhere it had clearly already been suspected. The confirmation of a thing you have known and refused to know, suddenly refusing to be refused any longer. She said, I stopped, started again. She described you as a tool, her word. She said once the plan was complete, you would be blamed for what happened to me, and she and Nicholas would be gone. The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas did not cry at this. He had moved past, crying into something quieter and more total. The expression of a man who has just understood the complete shape of something and is sitting very still inside that understanding, the way you sit very still when you are trying to decide whether the ground beneath you will hold. Then he looked at me, really looked at me the way he had looked at me when he was 7 years old and had broken Maggie's jewelry box and was waiting to find out if the world would end. What do we do, Dad? I leaned forward in my chair. I held my son's gaze. We do what this family has always done, I said. We prepare. We are patient. And we do not show our hand until the moment is exactly right. Thomas breathed in slowly through his nose. He nodded, not the nod of a man who has been reassured, but the nod of a man who has been given a direction and intends to walk in it. He stood to go. At the door, he stopped his hand on the frame, his back to me. Dad. His voice was very quiet. If something happens to me before this is finished, nothing, I said, is going to happen to you. I put every year of my life behind those words. Every year on the bench, every verdict I had ever delivered, every promise I had ever made to Maggie about the boy we were raising together. I promise you that, son. He stood in the doorway for one more moment. Then he nodded again and walked out, and I listened to his footsteps go down the hall and the soft close of his bedroom door. I sat in the dark for a long time, after that Rex back on the bed beside me, his warm weight against my leg. I thought about the promise I had just made. Then I picked up my pen and I got to work. The morning after Thomas came to my door, I sat across from him at the breakfast table and watched Brenda pour his coffee and ask about his schedule and laugh at something on the morning news. And I thought she has no idea that the man sitting 3 feet away from her spent last night learning exactly what she is. Thomas held it together beautifully, better than I had expected, better honestly than I had managed myself at his age under far less pressure. He ate his eggs. He talked about a listing in the north end of Harwick that had just come back on the market. He refilled his own coffee and asked Brenda if she needed anything from the hardware store, because he was passing by one later. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. The only thing that gave him away to someone who had known his face for 44 years was the way he chewed slower than usual, more deliberate the jaw, working with the careful precision of a man who is concentrating on something other than his food. I caught his eye once briefly and gave him the smallest nod I could manage. He gave it back. After Brenda left for her Tuesday appointment at 2 o'clock, I called Carol. She answered immediately. I was wondering when you'd call, she said, which was exactly what she had said the first time, and hearing the familiar rhythm of it loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since 11:47 the previous night. Thomas knows, I said. He came to me. He found a passport in her safe, a second identity issued 8 months ago. A pause. Then quietly, Good Lord, Arthur. I need to move faster, Carol. She's not going to wait indefinitely. No, Carol said. She's not. I heard the sound of papers moving, the click of a pen. Carol in her home office shifting into the mode I had watched her operate in for 30 years. Precise, fast, no wasted motion. The trust first. I finished drafting it 3 days ago. I've been waiting for you to call. I'm sending it to you this morning. Read it tonight, call me with any changes, and I'll have a notary at your door Thursday morning while Brenda is out. Thursday works, I said. Thomas will be there. Good, he should be. A pause. I also spoke with Diana Reeves yesterday. Agent Diana Reeves, FBI Philadelphia Field Office Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. Carol had mentioned her in our first real conversation, the name dropped carefully the way Carol dropped all important names, once clearly trusting you to remember it. What did she say? I asked. She's been reading the file I sent her, Carol said. Your notebook documentation, the Crestline materials Thomas photographed last week, Frank's signed statement about the prescription, she said, and I'm quoting directly that she hasn't seen a private citizen build a cleaner paper trail since a retired SEC attorney in Bucks County ran his own insider trading case in 2019. A beat. She wants 3 things before she moves formally. The recording from Ray she needs to verify its admissibility herself. The New Jersey connection confirmed with post-mortem evidence, which means she needs to pursue the exhumation order through Essex County, and she needs Frank on record officially, not just a signed statement. Frank will do whatever is needed, I said. He's been ready since the beginning. I know, Carol paused. Arthur Reeves is applying for the Essex County exhumation order this week. It takes 2 to 3 weeks to process through the NJ court system, but she has a contact in the medical examiner's office who has confirmed the conditions are sufficient for digoxin testing, even after 6 years. If that test comes back positive, it changes everything, I said. It changes everything, Carol agreed. Attempted murder becomes conspiracy to commit murder with a confirmed prior victim. That's a federal pattern. That's life without parole territory. I sat with that for a moment. Harold Weston. 78 years old, Valentine's Day, nobody in his corner. Not this time, I thought. That afternoon, Thomas sent me a message through the Signal application Ray had installed on both our phones before he went dark, an encrypted messaging platform that left no readable trace on the phone carrier's servers. The message was brief, found more Crestline documents in the home office filing cabinet, photographed everything, also found what looks like a burner phone in the lining of her winter coat. Didn't touch it. I typed back, good. Leave everything exactly as you found it. Don't change anything she can notice. 3 dots appeared while Thomas composed his reply. Then, how are you holding up? I looked at the question for a moment. My 74-year-old son asking his father how he was holding up from 3 rooms away in an encrypted application, while the woman who intended to end my life was somewhere in this house running a vacuum cleaner over the living room rug. Better than she thinks, I typed back. Much better than she thinks. On Thursday morning at 9:15, while Brenda was at her yoga appointment that was not yoga, a woman named Patricia Oakes arrived at my front door carrying a leather briefcase and a notary seal. She was 60 years old and had been notarizing legal documents for Carol Simmons's clients for 22 years. And she shook my hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to witness and certify and ask no unnecessary questions. Thomas sat beside me at the dining room table. He had taken the morning off work, told Brenda he had a contractor coming about the roof gutters. He sat with his back straight and his hands flat on the table, and he read every page of the trust document with the careful attention of a man who had learned at significant personal cost the importance of reading before signing. When it was done, my signature, Thomas's signature, as named beneficiary, Patricia Oakes' seal pressed firm and official into the lower corner of the final page, I felt the particular satisfaction of something being properly secured. The house, the investment accounts, 31 years of 2 people building a life together, protected now in a structure that Brenda could not reach, could not contest, could not redirect, regardless of what happened to me. Is that it? Thomas asked, looking at the sealed document. That's it, I said. He nodded. He pressed his lips together and looked down at the table for a moment, and when he looked back up, his eyes were bright but dry. Mom would have had something to say about all of this, he said. Something practical and slightly dark and exactly right. My throat tightened. She would have said we should have done it years ago. Thomas almost smiled. Almost. Yeah, he said. That's exactly what she would have said. Patricia Oakes left at 9:50. Thomas went to make coffee. I sat at the dining room table with the signed trust in front of me, and I looked around the room at the china cabinet Maggie had found at an estate sale in Lancaster, at the watercolor of the Susquehanna River she had hung above the sideboard, at the small brass hook by the kitchen door, where Rex's leash had hung for 11 years. This was mine, all of it, and it was going to stay that way. My phone buzzed. Carol. A text message, 4 words. Reeves filed the order. Essex County, New Jersey, Harold Weston. After 6 years of no one looking, someone was finally going to look. I set the phone face down on the table, and I breathed slowly through my nose the way I had learned to breathe in courtrooms when something important had just been decided. Then the front door opened, and Brenda came in from her appointment, unwinding her scarf, calling out that she had stopped at the bakery on Elm Street and picked up something for lunch. "Wonderful," I called back, my voice carrying exactly the right warmth, exactly the right ease. "Thomas is making coffee." I picked up the trust document and folded it carefully into the inside pocket of my cardigan, close against my chest. And by the time Brenda appeared in the dining room doorway, I was reading the morning newspaper, and there was nothing in my face to read at all. The Weather Service issued the warning at 6 in the morning. I heard it on the small radio I kept on the kitchen counter, the same radio Maggie had bought at a yard sale in 1997, the one with the cracked plastic casing she had fixed with electrical tape and refused to replace because she said a radio that still worked was a radio that deserved to keep working. Nor'easter moving up the coast. Expected landfall along the Pennsylvania interior by late afternoon. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Power outages likely across Harwick Township and surrounding areas. Residents advised to prepare. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at the sky to the west. It had gone the color of old brass, that particular yellow-gray that Pennsylvania skies turned before serious weather. A color Maggie had always called the color of a held breath. She had hated storms. Every bad storm she would find a reason to be in whatever room I was, in a book in her hand, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, pretending she was there for the light or the chair or some other reason entirely. I had never once called her on it. Some things you protect by not naming them. Rex was restless. He had been pacing since before I woke, his nails clicking in irregular rhythm on the hardwood floors, pausing at windows, resuming. Dogs knew weather the way they knew other things, not through data, but through some older, more reliable channel. Brenda came downstairs at 7:30, looking as she always did, entirely composed. "Quite a storm coming," she said, pouring herself coffee with the unhurried ease of someone who had already decided how the day was going to go. "So I hear," I said. She turned from the counter. "I was thinking Thomas should go get supplies before it gets bad. Generator fuel water, the usual." She smiled. "I'd feel better knowing we're prepared." Thomas, who had come down behind her, looked at me over her shoulder, a brief questioning look. I gave him the smallest nod. "Sure," Thomas said. "I can head out now before it gets bad. Dad, anything specific you need?" "Whatever you think is best," I said. "You know the house." He left at 9. His truck disappeared down Harwick Ridge Road, and I stood at the front window watching it go, and I felt the particular quality of the house change around me, the way a room changes when a third presence is removed, and two people who have never been alone together are suddenly alone together for the first time. I went to my study. I sat at my desk. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the time and the weather conditions, because a judge's habit does not stop even when the court is his own kitchen. Then I wrote 3 words she sent him. Brenda appeared in the doorway at 11. "Arthur?" Her voice was the warm, attentive version, the voice she used in company, the voice that had taken me 2 years to start hearing correctly. "I wanted to remind you about your late morning dose. With the storm coming, it might be good to take it a bit early." I looked up from the notebook. The page I had turned to was blank, nothing visible. "I'll take it after lunch," I said. "Old habit, I always take it with food." Something moved across her face, the faintest tightening, the smallest recalculation before the smile returned. "Of course," she said. "Whatever works for you." She withdrew. I listened to her footsteps go back toward the kitchen, and I reached down and put my hand on Rex's back. He was sitting pressed against my leg with a rigidity that had nothing to do with the cold. "I know," I said quietly. "Not long now." She had not noticed. People who are very focused on finishing something rarely notice the small changes in the thing they believe they have already won. She was looking at the end of the plan. She was not looking at me. The sky outside went dark early, the way December skies did in Pennsylvania, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had simply decided the day was finished. By 4 o'clock, the wind was moving through the maple trees with a sound like water, the branches thrashing against each other in long, irregular arcs. The first rain arrived at 4:30 horizontal, and Sirius hitting the study window in sheets. The doorbell rang at 6. I heard Brenda cross the front hallway. I heard the door open. And then I heard a voice I recognized not from this house, not from any welcome context, but from a pharmacy counter on a Wednesday morning when I had pretended to be confused about drug interactions while cataloging the cost of a wristwatch. Nicholas Farrell. His voice was apologetic and slightly breathless, carrying the performance of a man caught out in bad weather. "I'm so sorry to just show up like this. I live about 4 miles east and the road is flooding. I didn't know where else. I know this is completely out of nowhere." And Brenda's voice warm and immediately accommodating. "Nicholas, of course, come in. Please don't even think about it. Let me get you a towel. Wendy's. Too fast? The welcome was too fast, too smooth, the choreography of two people who had rehearsed this entrance. Thomas arrived back at 6:15, his jacket dark with rain, 2 paper bags of supplies in his arms. He stepped into the front hallway and stopped when he saw Nicholas standing in our living room, with a mug of tea Brenda had already made him. And for one moment, just one, Thomas's face did something complicated and uncontrolled. Then he looked at me, standing in the study doorway. I held his gaze. Gave him nothing, no alarm, no signal, just the steady look of a man who is not surprised and needs his son to match that steadiness. Thomas set the bags down on the hallway table. "Hey," he said to Nicholas, his voice entirely normal. "Some weather out there." "Terrible." Nicholas agreed, and his eyes went to me. Briefly, a flicker quickly redirected, and I watched him catalog whatever he saw in my face and find, I hoped, nothing useful. At 7:53, the power went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout, a single clean cut. The lights dying all at once, the hum of the refrigerator and the furnace and the small motor of Maggie's old radio going silent in the same instant, and the house dropping into a darkness that felt, after the noise of the storm, almost absolute. Rex moved against my leg, immediately a warm, solid pressure. Brenda's voice came from across the room, calm and redirecting. "Arthur, why don't you go upstairs and rest? Thomas and Nicholas can handle the generator. You shouldn't be on your feet in the dark." Her voice. Not the warm voice, not the attentive voice. Something underneath those voices, the flat, certain tone of the thing that wore them. I picked up my cane from beside the armchair. I stood. I let myself look like a man who was tired and grateful for the suggestion. A man of 74 for whom darkness and cold and the noise of a storm were simply too much. "That sounds like a good idea," I said. "Don't fuss over me." I moved toward the hallway. Rex walked beside me, his shoulder against my leg. Behind me, in the moment before I turned the corner, I heard Brenda say something very low, just beneath the sound of the wind words I was not supposed to hear. 2 words. 20 minutes.
I did not stop walking. I did not change my pace. I turned the corner into the hallway, and I put my back against the wall in the dark, and I stood very still, and I breathed, and I let 30 years of keeping my face still, in rooms where everything depended on it, do what 30 years of practice had made it capable of. Then I reached into my cardigan pocket, and I found Thomas's phone, the one I had taken from him quietly in the hallway, when he came in, pressed into my palm. During the half-second we stood close together, setting down the grocery bags, the exchange so brief that neither Brenda nor Nicholas had registered it. I opened the messages. I typed Frank Guthrie's number from memory. 4 words. Code red 4417 Harwick Ridge Road. Send. I put the phone in my pocket. I looked down at Rex in the dark, his eyes catching what little light came through the hallway window, bright and steady and entirely focused on me. "All right, old boy," I said very quietly. "This is it." I counted the minutes in the dark. Not by clock, the power was gone, and my watch needed light to read. I counted by the storm, by the intervals between lightning and thunder, the way Maggie had taught Thomas to do when he was small and frightened of bad weather. Count the seconds between the flash and the sound, and that tells you how far away it is. The storm was close, very close. The lightning came, and the thunder followed almost immediately, the sound rolling through the walls of the old house, like something physical, like a weight pressing in from every direction at once. I stood in the hallway with my back against the wall, and Rex pressed against my leg, and I counted. At 18 minutes, I heard the first movement downstairs. Not Thomas. Thomas moved through this house the way someone who had grown up in it moved, with the particular unconscious knowledge of which floorboards carried sound, and which didn't, the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. What I heard was different, deliberate but uncertain, the careful movement of someone navigating a space by memory rather than familiarity. Nicholas was on the ground floor, moving toward the kitchen. Brenda was on the stairs. I knew it was her from the weight of the step lighter than Thomas, more controlled than Nicholas, the tread of someone who had been in this house long enough to have learned some of its geography, but not all of it. Her flashlight beam appeared at the top of the stairs, sweeping left, sweeping right, probing the hallway. I had already moved. This was the advantage she did not know I had, the only advantage that mattered. I had lived in this house for 31 years. I had walked its hallways in the dark 1,000 times, to the bathroom at 3 in the morning, to Thomas's room, when he was young and sick, to the kitchen for the glass of water that Maggie always forgot to bring to bed. I knew which floorboards sang and which ones held silent. I knew the width of the gap between the linen closet door and the wall. I knew that the hallway bent slightly to the left, 12 steps from the stairs, a structural quirk of the original 1890s construction that caught people unfamiliar with it every time. Brenda's flashlight beam caught the bend wrong. She paused, recalibrated. I was already 4 rooms away. Rex moved with me, his paws finding the silent boards with an instinct I could not explain and did not question. 11 years of walking this house beside me had apparently taught him the same geography. He did not make a sound. I heard Thomas before I found him. A low sound from the front sitting room. Not a word, not a call, something more involuntary than either of those things. I moved through the doorway and found him on the floor beside the couch, his back against it, one hand pressed to his temple. In the intermittent lightning coming through the sitting room windows, I could see his face dazed, blinking, the particular unfocused expression of a man whose head had just been struck hard enough to interrupt his connection with the immediate world. I crouched beside him. My knees screamed at the angle, and I did not care. "Thomas!" I kept my voice below the sound of the rain. "Thomas, look at me." His eyes found my face. For a moment they did not quite track. Then something sharpened behind them, the return of recognition. The specific relief of a man who has been frightened and has just found the one person he was most afraid he would not find. "Dad!" His voice was rough, barely audible. "He came out of..." I didn't hear him. I know. I put my hand on his face the way I had put my hand on his face when he was small and feverish and the world had narrowed to the size of a sick room. "Can you stand?" He tried. He made it halfway up and then grabbed the arm of the couch, swaying his other hand, still pressed to his temple. The wound was not deep. I could see that much in the lightning, but the force of it had taken something from him that would need time to return. "Stay here," I said. "Stay down and stay quiet. Do you understand me?" "Dad, I can. Thomas." I waited until his eyes steadied on mine. "Trust me, stay here." He nodded. It cost him something, that nod. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the couch arm. My son, who wanted to protect me, being asked to let me protect him instead. He nodded anyway. I straightened up. I reached into my cardigan pocket and confirmed by touch what I needed to confirm: Thomas's phone, the trust document folded inside my breast pocket, the recorder locked in the study cabinet where it had been since Friday morning. Then I did the thing that I had been planning since the moment I heard Brenda say 20 minutes in the dark hallway. I moved toward the basement door. The beam of Brenda's flashlight was visible now. At the far end of the second-floor hallway, she had found the right geometry of the bend and was moving faster. Nicholas was somewhere behind me, the sound of his footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, working his way toward the hallway. They were compressing the space, closing it down. It was a sound tactical instinct, and under other circumstances I might have admired it. What they did not know, what neither of them could know, was that I had no intention of running. I opened the basement door, and I switched on the small flashlight I had taken from the junk drawer 3 days ago and placed in my cardigan pocket on Monday morning, because I had known with the certainty of a man who had spent a career reading the direction events were moving that this night was coming. I let the beam show under the basement door crack for exactly 3 seconds, enough to be seen from the hallway. Then I went through and pulled the door nearly closed behind me, leaving a gap of 2 inches, enough light to follow, not enough to illuminate what waited at the bottom of the stairs. Rex followed me down, his paws completely silent on the wooden steps. I heard Brenda's voice above me, low and quick. "There. The basement?" Nicholas, closer now. "You sure? I saw the light." Her footsteps moved toward the basement door. "Go first." A pause. Then Nicholas's heavier tread on the top step. I moved to the far wall of the basement and stood beside the furnace, the oldest part of the house, a cast-iron behemoth installed in 1923, that Maggie had always said looked like something from a Jules Verne novel. I switched off my flashlight, waited. The basement stairs were 14 steps. I counted Nicholas's footfalls, 11, 12, 13, 14. He reached the bottom and swept his beam around the space. It caught the furnace, the water heater, the shelves of Christmas decorations Maggie had labeled, in her careful handwriting, the stack of banker's boxes from my years on the bench. The beam moved past me twice before it stopped. "Judge!" Nicholas's voice, trying for authority, finding something closer to apology. "Come on, you can't, this doesn't have to be—" "The records room," Brenda said from behind him, already moving. Her beam had found the door at the back of the basement. The room I had built into the original structure in 1998, reinforced walls, climate-controlled, where 30 years of case files and personal legal documents lived behind a door I had specified to the contractor at considerable expense. "He's going for the records room." She was right. I was going for it. That was entirely the point. I let them follow me through the door. I let them come in far enough that Nicholas was fully inside and Brenda was crossing the threshold, her beam sweeping across the shelving units that lined every wall from floor to ceiling, the hundreds of labeled boxes, the locked filing cabinets, the accumulated documentation of 3 decades of federal jurisprudence. Then I stepped out. The door was 400 pounds of fire-rated steel, installed with a commercial-grade frame, and a deadbolt I had specified after a convicted felon had sent threatening letters to my home address in 2001. It had never been used for the purpose it was built for. I had told Maggie it was a precaution. She had told me I was being dramatic. I gripped the handle. Brenda's beam swung toward me. For 1 second, the same second I had been waiting for. Since October, the same half-second before the lie that I had learned to read in 30 years of courtrooms, her face did something uncontrolled. "I know who you are," I said. "Diane?" Her eyes went wide. I pulled the door shut. The deadbolt engaged with a sound that I had not heard before that moment, a sound I recognized anyway from the core of some deep professional memory, as the sound of a verdict being delivered, clean, final, permanent. From inside, Nicholas's voice rising. Brenda's voice, the performance entirely stripped away, now shouting something I did not bother to parse because it contained nothing I needed to hear. I set my back against the wall beside the door, and I slid down until I was sitting on the cold concrete floor. My cane across my knees, the storm grinding away at the house above me. Rex walked over and stepped directly into my lap, all 70 pounds of him, his great head pushing up under my chin, his warm weight settling across my legs, with the complete confidence of a dog who has decided this is where he belongs. I put both arms around him. I thought about Harold Weston. I thought about Maggie. I thought about Thomas upstairs with his hand pressed to his head, waiting the way I had asked him to wait. "It's all right," I said to Rex, to the room, to whatever was listening. "It's over." Then from the top of the basement stairs, Thomas's voice, still rough, still unsteady, but finding its way back, "Dad." I closed my eyes, breathed. "Down here, son," I said. "I'm right down here." Thomas came down the basement stairs one at a time, his left hand trailing the wall, his right hand holding a lighter he'd found in the kitchen drawer, the small flame throwing uneven shadows on the basement wall. The beam found me on the floor beside the records room door, and he made a sound, not a word, something before, words the involuntary noise of a man who has been afraid for someone and has just found them. And then he was crossing the basement floor in 4 long strides and dropping to one knee beside me. "Dad." His hand went to my arm, my shoulder checking the way you check something you are terrified to find broken. "Are you hurt? What happened to—" His eyes went to the records room door, to the deadbolt, to the sounds coming from the other side, muffled now, less frantic, the sounds of 2 people who had begun to understand the quality of what was containing them. His face did something extraordinary. The full passage from confusion to comprehension, to a kind of stunned, exhausted relief that I had not seen on my son's face since the morning after Maggie's funeral, when he had finally slept. "You locked them in. The door has been there since 1998, I said. "I always told your mother it was a precaution." Thomas looked at me for a long moment. Then a laugh came out of him, short and rough and completely involuntary. The laugh of a man whose body has decided that this specific detail is too much to absorb with any dignity. He pressed the back of his hand over his mouth and got himself back. "Are you hurt?" he asked again. His eyes were wet at the corners, and he was not bothering to hide it. Cold floor, I said. Knees will file a formal complaint in the morning, otherwise intact. I put my hand on his forearm. He touched his temple carefully with 2 fingers. Headache. I'll live. He looked at the door again. How long until Frank gets here? I sent the message 18 minutes ago, I said. He'll have called 911 immediately. Rural response in Harwick Township runs 12 to 15 minutes in normal conditions. I glanced upward where the storm was still working at the house. Tonight, probably longer, but Frank won't wait at the end of the driveway. He'll meet them at the road and bring them in. Thomas nodded, processing this. Then there's a key. I know. Mom's jewelry box. His voice changed slightly on the word mom, the particular frequency shift that happened when either of us said it without preparing to say it first. I remember you telling her about it once. A spare. She kept everything spare. My throat tightened. She kept everything that mattered, I said. Thomas stood. He steadied himself against the wall for a moment, the headache, the residual dizziness from the blow, and then he straightened to his full height and looked down at me on the floor with an expression I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. Not the expression of a son looking at a father, the expression of one person looking at another person they have just fully understood. I'm going to get the key, he said, and then I'm going to open the front door for Frank. A pause. Don't move. I'm 74 years old and sitting on a concrete floor in the dark, I said. I wasn't planning to. He almost smiled. He went up the stairs. Rex had not moved from my lap. He was heavier than any dog his age had a right to be, and I did not want him to move. I could feel his heartbeat against my ribs, steady, unhurried, the heartbeat of an animal, with no capacity for the particular human torture of imagining all the ways things could have gone differently. From the records room, silence now. Not the silence of people who had stopped trying, the silence of people who were listening. Good, I thought. Let them listen to the storm. Let them listen to the sound of everything they built coming apart. I heard Thomas upstairs, his footsteps crossing the master bedroom floor, the soft sound of the jewelry box being opened. Maggie's jewelry box, dark walnut, the small brass clasp from a market in Vermont. The box Thomas had dropped at 9 years old and wept over before deciding he was fine. I had not opened it since the night she died. Thomas had found the spare key to a door I had not thought he knew about in a box he had been afraid to look inside for 3 years because his mother had kept everything that mattered. I pressed my face briefly into the top of Rex's head. She thought of everything, I told him, even things that hadn't happened yet. Then from the top of the basement stairs, Thomas's voice still rough, still unsteady, but finding its way back, Dad. I closed my eyes, breathed. Down here, son, I said. I'm right down here. Thomas came down the basement stairs with the small brass key in his hand. I heard him before I saw him. His footsteps crossing the floor above, moving toward the room at the end of the hall where Maggie's jewelry box had sat for 31 years. The room I had not entered since the night she died. He knew where to look. She had kept everything that mattered, and somehow, across 3 years and all the distance grief puts between a man and the things he cannot touch, Thomas had remembered. He crouched beside me and held up the key. Found it, he said. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. I know you did, I said. He went to the records room door. He inserted the key. The deadbolt drew back with the same clean certainty with which it had engaged, and the door opened. Nicholas Farrell stood in the doorway, with his hands already raised, his face the color of old concrete, every bit of fight gone out of him. He had been in far deeper than he understood when he got in, and now that it was over, what I saw on his face was not defiance. It was relief. Brenda stood behind him. She did not raise her hands immediately. She stood with her weight evenly distributed, her chin level, her eyes moving across the room with the rapid calculation of someone still looking for an exit that no longer existed. Then her gaze came to rest on me, sitting on the cold concrete floor. Rex in my lap, my back against the wall, entirely undramatic, entirely fine, and something shifted in her face that I had not seen there before. Not fear, something more precise than fear. The recognition that she had miscalculated. The lights came on, all at once the basement fluorescence flickering twice and holding the furnace resuming its low hum beneath us, the whole house shuddering back to life. Through the basement window, Wells I saw the first sweep of blue and red light moving across the frost-covered grass of the backyard. Then Frank's voice from the top of the stairs. "Arthur?" The particular cadence of it, careful, steady, the voice of a man who had been carrying something difficult for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. "Arthur, are you down there?" "Here, Frank," I said. His face appeared at the top of the stairs, and behind him, the dark uniforms of the Harwick Township Police, and behind them, Agent Diana Reeves, FBI Philadelphia Field Office, in a dark jacket with her credentials already in her hand. Two officers moved past Thomas and took Nicholas by the arms. He went without resistance, head down, shoulders curved inward. A third officer approached Brenda. She stood very still and did not look away from my face until the handcuffs were on. Then she stopped at the foot of the stairs. The officer with her paused. She looked at me, really looked at me, the way she had not, since October, since before she had decided I was simply a problem to be managed. Her eyes were cold and clear, and entirely without the warmth she had spent 4 years performing. "You got lucky, old man," she said, quietly, precisely. I looked back at her. "No, Diane," I said. "Harold Weston got unlucky. I got Frank." She had nothing to say to that. The officer guided her up the stairs, and she went her heels, finding each step with the same controlled precision she brought to everything, and she did not look back. Agent Reeves crossed the basement and crouched down to my level. "Judge Calloway," she said. "In 14 years with the Bureau, I have not seen a private citizen construct a more complete evidentiary record. Not once." I looked past her to where Frank was standing at the bottom of the stairs, still in his green pharmacy vest, the laminated badge that said Frank and below it, 24 years. He was watching me with an expression that was not quite relief, not quite pride, not quite grief, but somehow all three at once. I caught his eye. He nodded once, the same small nod he had given me across the hood of his delivery van on October 7th. I nodded back. Thomas gripped my forearm and helped me to my feet. I stood. Rex stepped off my lap, shook himself, and pressed against my leg. Frank came and stood beside us, the three of us in that basement under the fluorescent lights, the storm already thinning above the thunder moving east. We did not need to say anything at all, which was, I had always believed, the truest measure of the right company. Rex sat on my foot. "Good boy," I said. He wagged once, slow, dignified, and leaned his old head against my leg. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia smelled exactly the way I remembered it. Lemon wood, polish, old paper, the particular metallic cool of recycled air, carrying the weight of 10,000 decisions made within those walls. I had always found it calming, the smell of process, the smell of consequence. I sat in the gallery for the first time in my life. Thomas was beside me in his charcoal suit, the same one he had worn to Maggie's funeral. His hands were folded in his lap. He had lost weight since December, and the suit hung differently than before, and I thought he looked older in the face and younger in the eyes at the same time. Frank sat 2 rows behind us. 3 days of personal leave, his first in 11 years. The proceedings took 4 days. Frank testified about the prescription forms, with the quiet certainty of a man who had done his job for 24 years and knew exactly what he had seen. Agent Reeves presented the signal messages, the passport, the Crestline documents Thomas had photographed. The forensic accountant traced 14 months of shell company transfers that had begun before Thomas and Brenda's wedding. Then the recording was played. Brenda's attorney argued Pennsylvania wiretapping, 2-party consent inadmissible. The assistant U.S. attorney was precise. Raymond Kowalski had been present in that apartment, as an invited participant had identified himself on the recording before the relevant statements were made. Under federal statute 18 U.S.C. Section 2511, subsection 2, TA participant may record a conversation without the knowledge of other parties. Judge Harriet Odom, 19 years on the federal bench, agreed. When the bailiff pressed play, Brenda's voice filled the courtroom. "Thomas is just a tool, a very useful, very stupid tool." I did not look at Thomas when those words came through the speakers. I looked straight ahead, but I felt him beside me, the small, involuntary tightening that moves through a body when it hears something it already knew and is hurt by it anyway. His hand found my forearm. He gripped it once briefly. I put my hand over his and held it there. Harold Weston, exhumed by court order in January. Postmortem toxicology confirmed chronic elevated digoxin dosing. The medical examiner testified that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, Harold's death had been caused by digoxin toxicity. The courtroom was very quiet when she finished. Gary Weston Harold's nephew from Montclair sat 3 rows behind Frank. I met him in the lobby on the first morning. He had shaken my hand with both of his eyes red, unable to say much. I told him someone had finally listened. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 12 minutes. Diane Marsh, known as Brenda Calloway, guilty on all counts. Life without parole. Nicholas Farrell, 35 years, no early parole. Thomas suspended sentence 3 years, 500 hours community service. He stood straight when his sentence was read, chin level, hands still. When the gavel came down, Thomas turned to me, jaw-working eyes bright. "Dad, I'm sorry for everything I didn't see." My throat tightened. "You trusted your wife. That is not a failure." I put my hand on his face the 3rd time in this story, the last time for this reason. The midnight knock, the safe combination, your mother's jewelry box. That is what I will remember. His shoulders shook once hard, released then steadied. Frank appeared at the end of our row. He looked as always like a man comfortable with exactly who he was. "I'm glad it came out right," he said. "So am I, Frank," I said. "So am I." Thomas straightened his jacket and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in years. Open, clear, uncertain, the way new beginnings always are. "Quarry Road," he said. I reached for my cane. "Quarry Road," I said. "October in Pennsylvania does not ask permission. It simply arrives the maples along Quarry Road going red overnight, the air turning sharp and clean, the sky that particular shade of blue that only exists in the fall, the kind of blue that makes you feel, regardless of what the year has held, that something is beginning rather than ending. I had lived in Pennsylvania for 74 years, and I had never once taken October for granted. But standing at the top of the gravel track with my cane in my hand and 40 acres rolling away in front of me, I understood the season differently than I ever had before. Some years teach you things that cannot be learned any other way. Thomas was already at the south fence when I got there. He had driven out early before I arrived, and he was crouching beside a leaning post, with a level in one hand and a notebook in the other, measuring angles, making notes in the careful way he had started doing everything these past months, with attention, with patience, without rushing toward a conclusion before the ground was ready. He was thinner than he had been in December, and broader across the shoulders, the result of weekends rebuilding a gymnasium floor at the community center where he was completing his service hours. Physical work, the honest kind. The kind that asks nothing of your mind and gives everything back to your body and leaves you tired in a way that is entirely different from the tired he had been carrying for 4 years. He looked up when he heard my cane on the gravel. His face was open in a way I had not seen it in a very long time. Not the careful openness of a man who has rehearsed his expression, but the unguarded kind that comes when someone has finally set something heavy down and walked away from it. "Post worse than I thought," he said. "Going to need to pull it and reset. Maybe 4 others along this line." "Then that's what we do," I said. Rex was already in the meadow, his gray muzzle down his tail, up moving through the tall bronze grass, with the focused happiness of an animal that has found exactly the right place to be. I watched him disappear and reappear 20 yards out, turning slow circles, his nose reading whatever the October wind was carrying. He was 11 years old, and his hips complained on cold mornings, and he had earned every gray hair on his muzzle. But out here in the meadow, with the wind in the grass, he moved like a dog who had forgotten he was supposed to be old. He looked younger out here. We both did, I thought. Thomas stood and came to stand beside me, both of us looking out at the 40 acres rolling toward the tree line. The farmhouse behind us needed work. The porch sagged at the left corner. The windows wanted new glazing. And there was a section of roof above the kitchen that would need attention before the first hard freeze, but the barn was solid, post and beam construction from 1887, built to outlast everything asked of it. Some things held. Not everything that was old was weak, and not everything that had survived damage was broken. I had been thinking that a great deal lately. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the small pine box I had carried from the house, that morning, sealed against the weather with 2 coats of exterior varnish. Thomas looked at it with the expression of a man who has learned not to assume he knows what a thing contains before it is opened. "Open it," I said. He did. Inside, wrapped carefully in a square of blue fleece cut from the blanket that had been folded at the bottom of Maggie's closet since the winter before she died, was the photograph from my nightstand Maggie at Thomas's college graduation. Laughing at something just outside the frame, her hand pressed flat against my chest, the way she always stood when she was happy, when she had forgotten to perform happiness and was simply having it. Thomas's throat moved. His thumb traced the corner of the frame very slowly, not wiping anything away, just moving the way hands move when the mind is somewhere else entirely. His eyes went bright and wet, and he did not try to hide it, which was, I thought, the right response. Some things deserve to be felt without apology, without the performance of composure, without the particular masculine habit of swallowing what should be said out loud. "I brought her here too," I said. "I thought she should see it." He stood with the photograph for a long moment. Then he carried it to the farmhouse and set it on the windowsill just inside the front window, facing south, facing the meadow, facing the direction the afternoon light came from. He stepped back and looked at it there on the sill, her face turned toward the field, and something in the set of his shoulders changed a weight I had been watching him carry for months, shifting very slightly, redistributing itself into something more manageable. He came back and stood beside me. "Dad." His voice was quiet. The particular quiet of a man choosing his words because they matter. "You think Mom would have liked it here?" I looked at the south fence line, at the good afternoon sun coming across the meadow in long, warm bars laying itself across the bronze grass and turning it briefly golden, at the corner post, standing straight where everything around it had begun to lean, at the 40 acres of Pennsylvania that no one was going to take from us. "She would have planted tomatoes right there," I said, "by the south fence before we finished unpacking. She would have told us the soil needed amendment, and she would have been right, and by July she would have had more tomatoes than 2 people could reasonably eat, and she would have been completely unapologetic about it." Thomas laughed the real laugh, the one that came from somewhere below the damage of the past year, the laugh of the boy who had grown up in a house where his mother was always right about the things that could be grown and usually right about everything else. It was the first time I had heard that laugh in longer than I wanted to count, and the sound of it did something in my chest that I did not try to name because some things are better felt than analyzed. Rex came back from the meadow and sat directly on my foot with the calm certainty of a dog who has decided that this specific patch of ground at this specific moment is exactly where he is supposed to be. I looked down at him. Gray muzzle, patient eyes, the slow, dignified wag of a dog who had done everything that was asked of him across 11 years and had no complaints about how any of it had turned out. "Good boy," I said. He wagged again once and pressed his old head against my leg. Thomas was already walking the fence line notebook open, measuring the first post, spacing with the practiced eye of a man who had decided what he was building and was not going to wait to begin. I watched him for a moment, this man, my son, 44 years old, moving across Pennsylvania ground in October, light with a measuring tape in his hand and a notebook under his arm, building something real after a year of discovering how much had been false. I thought about Frank, who had called last week to say his granddaughter had taken her first steps, and he wished Elaine could have seen it, and who had laughed when I told him about the tractor we were considering purchasing, and said that a retired federal judge operating a tractor was either the most sensible thing he'd ever heard, or the least, and he wasn't sure which. I thought about Carol, who had called from Philadelphia to say she had planted a kitchen garden for the first time in 20 years, and that she held me personally responsible because I had apparently reminded her that it was never too late to start something from the ground up. I thought about Ray, who had sent a brief message 3 weeks ago, a photograph of the sign above the door of his newly expanded office, 3 agents instead of 1, the words Kowalski Investigations painted in clean black letters. No message with it, just the photograph. That was enough. I thought about Harold Weston, who had not had a Frank and whose nephew Gary had written me a letter in August, careful handwriting on plain stationery. 2 paragraphs saying only that he was glad someone had finally gone looking, and that his uncle had deserved better, and that he thought about him differently now that the truth had been spoken out loud. I thought about Maggie. I thought about her face in the photograph on the farmhouse windowsill, turned toward the meadow, toward the afternoon light. I thought about the blue fleece blanket and the spare key in the jewelry box and the address book with Ray's number written in her handwriting. I thought about all the ways she had prepared for things she would not be there to see quietly, and without announcement, the way she did everything that mattered. So, you won't be alone when I'm not there. Thomas looked up from the fence line and found me watching him. "You going to stand there all afternoon?" he said, "or are you going to come help?" I picked up my cane. I looked out at the 40 acres one more time, the tree line burning red at the far edge, Rex moving through the bronze grass, the farmhouse with its photograph in the window facing south. Then, I walked down to where my son was building something, and I helped. I spent 30 years deciding the fates of strangers in courtrooms. I never imagined I would spend one autumn deciding my own. If this family story teaches anything, let it be this. The people closest to you are not always who they appear to be. I was 74 years old, a federal judge, and I still nearly missed it. Do not wait until a stranger has to tell you the truth about your own home. Pay attention, ask questions. Trust what your instincts tell you when something feels wrong, because most of the time, they are right. I believe God places certain people in our path at exactly the moment we need them. Frank Guthrie was that person for me, an ordinary man who chose truth over silence. That single choice gave me back everything. This was a family betrayal that could have destroyed 2 lives. It nearly did. But family betrayal does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it wears a familiar face and sits at your breakfast table every morning. If my family story reaches one person who recognizes something in it, who chooses to look closer and ask harder questions, then every difficult morning was worth it. My personal belief, loyalty must be earned, not assumed. And silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that asks no difficult questions, is sometimes the most dangerous choice of all. This has been my family story. I hope it stayed with you. If it did, leave a comment below telling me what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, so you never miss what comes next, thank you for staying with me until the very end. It means more than I can say. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. If this type of content isn't right for you, we completely understand. Please feel free to explore other content that better suits your preferences.